The house still knew my name. That was the first thing I noticed after Saad got married. Not the change in furniture or the quiet rearranging of routines, but the way the house itself still responded to me. The floorboards creaked in familiar places. The kitchen light flickered the same way it always had. Even the old clock in the hallway ticked with the same patient rhythm, as if nothing in the world had shifted. And yet everything had. I woke up early that morning like I always did. It wasn't habit as much as instinct, my body rising before the sun without an alarm, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had done this for decades. I made my way to the kitchen, careful not to wake anyone. The house was quiet, full of sleeping breaths and closed doors. Once, that quiet belonged to me. I boiled water for tea and stood by the counter, waiting. I didn't rush. There was no one depending on the timing of my movements anymore. No lunchboxes to pack, no school uniforms to press, no quick mental checklist of things that would fall apart if I paused for too long. The freedom should have felt light. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. Saad and Sanaa slept upstairs in the room that used to hold my sewing table. I had given it up willingly, even proudly, telling myself that this was how life moved forward. A mother makes space. A family expands. I believed all of that, and I still do. But belief doesn't always soften the feeling of being replaced by quiet. When the kettle clicked off, I poured the water into my cup and sat at the small dining table near the window. Morning light spilled across the surface, soft and forgiving. For a moment, I allowed myself to pretend that nothing had changed. That Saad would come down any minute, hair still messy, asking what was for breakfast. That he would sit across from me, scrolling on his phone while I reminded him, again, to eat properly. Instead, the chair across from me stayed empty. Later, when they did come down, everything was gentle. Sanaa smiled warmly when she saw me, her voice soft with politeness. Saad kissed my forehead before pouring himself coffee. They moved easily around the kitchen, a quiet rhythm between them that didn't need instruction. I watched without interrupting. Sanaa asked if I had slept well. Saad reminded me about a doctor's appointment next week. They included me in their plans for the day, not because they had to, but because they wanted me to feel included. And I did. I really did. Still, something in me noticed the difference between being included and being needed. Once, this kitchen waited for my decisions. What we ate, when we ate, how the day unfolded, it all passed through me. Now, meals were discussed between them, plans formed without looking in my direction first. They weren't shutting me out. They simply weren't looking for permission anymore. That was the part one hadn't prepared for. I told myself this was good. Healthy. Exactly what I had raised Saad to become, a man capable of building a life without leaning on mine. And Sanaa, she was kind, thoughtful, respectful in ways that mattered. She never dismissed me, never spoke sharply, never acted as though I didn't belong, which made the feeling harder to explain. Because how do you grieve something no one took from you? In the afternoons, I found myself with time I didn't know how to fill. I used to plan my days around Saad's needs. Even when he was older, even when he pretended he didn't need me, there were small things, calls, reminders, favors that made me feel useful. Now, he handled his life efficiently, competently, without my involvement. I still cooked sometimes, but I asked first. I still offered help, but I waited for a response. I noticed how often the answer was, "It's okay, we've got it." We've got it. They said it kindly. They meant it sincerely. But each time, it landed the same way, a quiet reminder that I was no longer essential to the shape of their days. At night, when the house settled again, I sat alone in my room and thought about the strange truth I was learning. Love doesn't always disappear when it changes form. Sometimes, it stays exactly where it is, warm, steady, present, while its purpose quietly moves on. Saad still loved me. I could see it in the way he checked in, the way he listened when I spoke, the way he never forgot small details about my health or comfort. Sanaa treated me with care that felt genuine, not forced. I was still loved, but I was no longer needed. And I didn't know yet what to do with that realization, or who I was supposed to become now that my role had softened into something quieter, something undefined. I looked around the room, at the life I had built and slowly stepped back from, and wondered if this was what growing older truly meant. Not being pushed aside, just being gently outgrown. There was a time when love and need lived in the same place. I didn't realize it while I was inside it. While Saad was growing up, while my days revolved around making sure he was fed, focused, and safe. But looking back, I can see how tightly the two were woven together. He needed me, and that need made love feel urgent, visible, undeniable. Now, love existed on its own. It showed up in smaller ways, quieter ways, ways that didn't ask for anything in return. Sanaa bought groceries without asking me what we needed. She planned meals with a confidence that told me she had already learned the rhythms of the house. She remembered that I didn't like too much spice and adjusted dishes without mentioning it. These were thoughtful gestures, kind ones, but they carried no reliance. She didn't need my approval to get things right. She didn't need my approval to get things right. That was the part that stayed with me. When Saad was younger, even as he became an adult, he would still pause before making choices. He'd ask what I thought, not because he couldn't decide without me, but because my voice had always been part of his process. It gave me a quiet sense of place, a reminder that I still mattered in the structure of his life. Now, his decisions moved forward without that pause. One evening, I watched from the doorway as Saad and Sanaa discussed something, vacation plans, I think. They stood close, their heads tilted toward each other, voices low and focused. It wasn't secretive. It was intimate, a private language formed by shared responsibility. Saad noticed me and smiled. "We're thinking of going in April," he said casually. Not asking. Informing. "That sounds nice," I replied and meant it. And that was the truth that confused me most. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in the way people expect hurt to look like. There were no sharp words lodged in my throat, no resentment waiting to spill over. Just a soft awareness settling in my chest, heavy but calm. They loved me without leaning on me. In the afternoons, Sanaa would sit with her laptop at the dining table, working quietly. I would pass by with a glass of water, offering it out of habit. She'd thank me warmly, sometimes insisting I sit for a few minutes. We talked about small things, weather, grocery prices, shows she liked to watch in the evenings. She never treated me like a stranger. And yet, there was a distance I couldn't name. It wasn't physical. It wasn't emotional in the traditional sense. It was structural, like a wall that didn't block the view, but made it clear which side I was standing on. Her life, with Saad, didn't require my involvement. It functioned smoothly without my input, without my intervention. I remembered the early days of my own marriage, how unsure I had been, how much I leaned on older women for reassurance. Advice wasn't something I avoided back then, it was something I depended on. I wondered if Sanaa felt differently, or if this generation simply learned to carry its weight earlier. Once, she asked me about a recipe I used to make when Saad was young. Her tone was curious, respectful. I explained it carefully, step by step, happy to share something that felt like mine. She listened attentively, nodded, thanked me. Then, the next week, she made it on her own. Adjusted it slightly. Improved it, even. She told me she'd added a new spice. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I don't," I replied, smiling. And I didn't. Truly. But something inside me folded quietly inward, like a note that no longer needed to be read aloud. I realized then that being needed isn't about control. It's about connection that asks for presence. And when that asking disappears, you're left with affection that doesn't quite know where to rest. Saad still checked in with me, still made sure I was comfortable. He listened when I spoke, but he didn't seek guidance the way he once did. Our conversations had shifted, from advice and problem-solving to updates and reassurances. "I've got it handled," he'd say gently whenever I offered concern. And I believed him. That belief was both comforting and unsettling. At night, when I lay awake, I tried to understand the shape of this new love. It wasn't smaller. It wasn't colder. It just didn't need me in the way I had grown used to being needed. And perhaps that was the natural outcome of doing my job well, as a mother. Still, knowing that didn't erase the quiet ache. Because when love no longer leans on you, You have to learn how to stand on your own again. And I was just beginning to understand that this chapter of my life would not be about holding others up, but about learning how to hold myself. I noticed it first at dinner. Not because anyone said anything, no one did, but because there was a chair that no longer seemed to belong to anyone in particular. It was still there, pushed neatly under the table, clean and ready. Yet somehow, it felt optional. That chair was mine. Dinner used to be the moment when the day gathered itself around me. I decided what we ate, when we sat, how long we lingered. Even after Saad grew older, there was a rhythm that waited for my signal. Food cooled if I wasn't ready. Conversations paused until I sat down. Now, dinner began when they were ready. Sometimes they waited for me, sometimes they didn't. Not out of carelessness, just practicality. Sana worked late some evenings. Saad adjusted his schedule around hers. They coordinated quietly, efficiently, like people who had learned how to orbit each other without external gravity. When I joined them, they smiled, asked about my day, made space at the table. But the center had shifted. Their conversation flowed naturally between them. Plans, small frustrations, shared jokes that had formed without me present. I listened more than I spoke, nodding at the right moments, smiling when laughter passed across the table like a private current. I didn't feel excluded. I felt peripheral. It was a strange sensation, realizing you could disappear from a room without anyone needing to rearrange themselves. No disruption. No gap. Just continuity. Once, I excused myself early from dinner, claiming I was tired. No one protested. Sana offered to make me tea later. Saad reminded me to rest. They carried on eating, their voices blending softly behind me as I walked down the hallway. I paused for a moment, just outside the dining room, listening. The house didn't feel emptier without me in that moment. It felt the same. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. I began to notice it in other spaces too. When family visited, Sana handled hosting with ease. She knew where everything was, how much to prepare, when to refill cups. People complimented her warmth, her organization. They were right. I sat nearby, helping when asked, watching as she filled a role I once occupied completely. No one compared us. No one needed to. The transition had happened quietly, naturally, like seasons shifting without announcement. There was no resentment in me toward her, only a mild sadness toward myself for assuming that a role, once fulfilled, would always remain mine. Sometimes, Saad would glance at me during these gatherings, as if checking whether I was okay. I always was. Or at least I looked like I was. I smiled back, reassuring him without words. I didn't want him to feel torn. The truth was, I didn't want to be needed out of obligation. I wanted to be wanted out of presence. And I was learning that those two things don't always arrive together. In quieter moments, I found myself choosing seats instinctively, corners of the room, edges of conversations. Not because I was pushed there, but because I sensed where I fit best now. Where I wouldn't interrupt the flow of something that no longer depended on me. I remembered a time when Saad would look for me before speaking. When he'd wait for my reaction, my approval. Those pauses had given me shape. Now he moved forward smoothly, confidently, his life no longer angled toward mine for balance. I told myself this was success. That I had raised him well. That independence was the goal all along. And still, there was grief in realizing that success sometimes leaves you without a seat at the center of the table. One afternoon, I rearranged the living room slightly, nothing dramatic, just small adjustments. Sana noticed and thanked me. "It looks nice," she said kindly. But later, she moved one chair back to its original place. Quietly, efficiently. I watched her do it and said nothing. Because it wasn't about furniture. It was about function. The house no longer needed me to hold its shape. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I thought about that extra chair at the table. How it could be filled or not, and everything would still work. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't unloved. I was simply no longer essential to the structure of things. And perhaps that was the hardest truth so far. There was a time when my words carried weight without effort. I didn't have to insist or repeat myself. If I spoke, it was understood that what I said came from experience, from years of watching consequences unfold before they happened. Advice wasn't something I offered cautiously. It was part of my role, as natural as breathing. Now, it required permission. The first time I noticed the change, it was over something small. Sanaa was preparing a dish I had made countless times before. I watched from the doorway, recognizing that love can remain intact even as relevance gently fades. I used to believe that silence meant something was wrong. In my earlier years, if a room grew quiet, I felt compelled to fill it with conversation, advice, reassurance, or movement. Silence felt like neglect, like something unfinished waiting for my hands. A family, I believed, should hum with activity and voices, and I had always been the one to keep that hum alive. Now, silence lived comfortably in the house. It settled between Saad and Sanaa without tension. It wasn't awkward or heavy, it was shared. They could sit together on the couch, each absorbed in their own thoughts, and still feel connected. Their silence didn't ask for interpretation. It didn't demand intervention. Mine did. When I sat with them, my silence felt louder. I became aware of it in a way I never had before, as though it needed justification. I'd clear my throat, ask a small question, comment on something neutral. Anything to remind myself that I was still present, still participating. But gradually, I began to notice something uncomfortable. No one needed me to do that. They were content even when I didn't speak. One evening, I joined them in the living room after dinner. The television was on, but no one was really watching. Saad leaned back against the couch, Sanaa curled slightly toward him, her feet tucked under her. There was a peaceful familiarity in their posture. I sat in my usual chair. Minutes passed. No one spoke. I waited for the moment when someone would look toward me, inviting me into the conversation. It never came. Not because they were ignoring me, but because nothing required my input. The moment didn't exist. And for the first time, instead of forcing myself into it, I stayed still. I let the silence remain. It was uncomfortable at first. My mind searched for reasons. Should I ask about their day? Offer tea? Say something meaningful? My body felt restless, like a hand hovering over a task that no longer existed. Then something unexpected happened. The discomfort softened. The silence didn't swallow me. It didn't erase me. It simply existed alongside me, neutral and unbothered. And I realized that the space I used to fill was no longer empty, it was complete without me. That realization was both painful and freeing. I had spent so many years being the emotional glue of this family, anticipating needs before they were spoken, smoothing tension before it surfaced, holding everyone together with quiet effort. My usefulness had become my identity. Without it, I felt unsteady. Who was I, if no one needed me to manage the atmosphere? The next few days, I paid attention to my instincts. How often I opened my mouth only to close it again. How often I started walking toward the kitchen to prepare something, then stopped because someone else had already done it. How often I noticed problems that no longer required my solutions. Sanaa didn't need reminders. Saad didn't need guidance. The house ran on a rhythm that didn't revolve around me. And still, they were kind. That was the hardest part to accept. If they had been cold or dismissive, I could have framed my withdrawal as self-protection. But they weren't. Sanaa checked on me gently. Saad asked if I was comfortable. They included me where it felt natural, not forced. Their love didn't disappear. Their dependence did. One afternoon, Sanaa asked if I wanted to join her for a walk. It was a small invitation, casual. We walked slowly through the neighborhood, speaking lightly about the weather, about things she wanted to do with the house someday. She spoke as someone sharing, not seeking approval. At one point, she paused and asked, "Are you happy here?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes," I said after a moment. And it was true, just not in the way I had imagined happiness would look at this stage of my life. She nodded, as if sensing the complexity behind my answer, but not pressing for more. I appreciated that. She respected my silence in a way I was still learning to respect my own. That night, I sat alone in my room and thought about all the spaces I had filled over the years, emotional, physical, invisible. I had mistaken presence for purpose. I had believed that being needed was the same as being valued. Now, I was learning that value could exist without demand. But it required a different kind of strength. The strength to sit quietly without shrinking, the strength to let others lead without feeling replaced, the strength to exist without constant contribution. I began practicing restraint, not as withdrawal, but as respect. Respect for their independence. Respect for my own evolving role. I stopped offering solutions unless asked. I stopped hovering. I stopped explaining myself unnecessarily. Instead, I focused inward. I read more, took longer walks alone, rediscovered routines that belonged only to me. Slowly, I began building an identity that wasn't tied to usefulness. It wasn't easy. Some days, the ache returned without warning, a sharp reminder of who I used to be in this household. On those days, I allowed myself to feel it fully, without judgment. Grief, I learned, doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from transition. And transition demands patience. One evening, Saad knocked on my door and asked for my opinion on something, a decision he and Sana were considering. As I listened, I felt that old familiar warmth rise in my chest. He still trusted me. He still valued my perspective. But the difference was this. He didn't need my answer. He wanted it. That distinction changed everything. I gave my thoughts carefully, without urgency, without attachment to the outcome. When he thanked me, I felt steady, not validated, but acknowledged. Later, after he left, I sat quietly, reflecting. I hadn't filled a space. I had been invited into one. And that, I realized, was the role I was growing into, not the center, not the support beam, but something equally meaningful. A presence that didn't prop things up. A presence that simply existed. For most of my life, belonging had a shape. It looked like responsibility, like anticipation, like knowing what needed to be done before anyone asked. I belonged because I held things together, meals, moods, memories. My presence had weight because it carried obligation. Letting go of that weight felt like stepping into air. At first, I didn't trust it. I expected to fall, to feel irrelevant, disconnected, forgotten. Instead, I found myself hovering between who I had been and who I was becoming, unsure how to stand without anchoring myself to usefulness. Belonging, I was learning, did not require control. That lesson came to me slowly, through ordinary moments that no longer revolved around me. One Saturday morning, I woke early out of habit. The house was quiet. Saad and Sana slept in, their door closed. I stood in the kitchen, waiting for the familiar urge to prepare breakfast, to set things in motion. It didn't come. The kitchen remained still, and for once, I let it stay that way. I made tea just for myself and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood come alive. People walked dogs. A delivery truck passed. Life moved on without my direction, and I felt peaceful. Later that morning, Sana came into the kitchen, surprised to see me already there. She smiled, poured herself coffee, and sat across from me. We spoke easily about nothing important, about small observations that didn't need resolution. There was no hierarchy in that moment. No expectation. Just shared space. I realized then that control had once been my way of securing my place. If I managed everything, I couldn't be excluded. If I anticipated every need, I would always be essential. But control, I now saw, had also limited me. It kept me tied to roles instead of relationships. Over time, I noticed how much lighter I felt when I stopped managing outcomes. When Saad and Sana made decisions, I listened without bracing myself to intervene. When things didn't go as I would have planned, I resisted the urge to step in. Sometimes I disagreed quietly, and sometimes I discovered that my way wasn't the only way, just the familiar one. There were moments of temptation, though. Moments when old instincts flared. When I saw a problem forming and wanted to fix it before it surfaced. When I sensed tension and wanted to smooth it away. Each time I paused. Is this mine to carry? Often the answer was no. Letting go didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I trusted them to navigate their own lives. It meant I respected the autonomy I had worked so hard to give my son. One evening, Saad and Sanaa had a disagreement. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet tension that lingered in the air. I sensed it immediately, the way I always had. My body reacted before my mind caught up, preparing to intervene, to soften edges, to restore calm. I stayed in my room. It was one of the hardest things I'd done. Later, when the house felt lighter again, Saad came to me. He didn't ask for advice. He just talked. Shared how he felt, what he learned from the moment. I listened. That was enough. Belonging, I realized, sometimes means stepping back, so others can step forward. It means trusting that love doesn't disappear when you stop directing it. In the weeks that followed, I found new ways to be present. I joined them when invited. I declined when I needed space. I learned to say, "I'm okay," without explaining myself. I began honoring my own rhythms, resting when I was tired, speaking when I had something to say, staying quiet when I didn't. No one questioned it. The fear that had once haunted me, that without usefulness I would fade, began to loosen its grip. I was still here. Still seen. Still valued. Just differently. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the calm expression looking back at me. There was a steadiness there that hadn't existed before. I wasn't waiting to be needed. I wasn't scanning for gaps to fill. I was simply present. That presence felt stronger than any role I had ever held. I began to understand that control had given me security, but presence gave me peace. Control kept me busy. Presence kept me whole. And in that wholeness, I found a new sense of belonging, one that didn't require proof, effort, or constant validation. I belonged because I was part of the family, not because I ran it, not because I held it together, but because love, when it's real, doesn't disappear when you loosen your grip. It stays. Quietly. Steadily. Without demand. Choosing myself used to feel like betrayal. Not because anyone told me it was, but because I had spent most of my life believing that a mother's value came from sacrifice. From placing herself last without complaint. From bending until everyone else stood straight. So when the idea of choosing myself first appeared, it arrived wrapped in guilt. At first, it was subtle. A thought I pushed away quickly. Maybe I don't have to be available all the time. Maybe I don't have to explain every decision. Maybe my needs don't require justification. Those thoughts felt dangerous. But they also felt honest. The realization came one afternoon when Sanaa asked me if I wanted to attend a family gathering with them. Her tone was kind, open, but optional. She gave me space to decide without expectation. "I might stay home," I said. The words surprised both of us. She nodded immediately. "Of course. Whatever you feel like." No disappointment. No offense. That night, as I sat alone with a book and a quiet cup of tea, something shifted inside me. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't excluded. I was choosing. That distinction mattered more than I expected. For years, my presence had been automatic. If there was a gathering, I went. If there was a need, I filled it. If there was silence, I broke it. My absence had never been considered because it was never an option. Now it was. And choosing myself didn't create distance. It created balance. I started noticing how often I said yes out of habit rather than desire. How often I ignored my own fatigue because being available felt safer than setting boundaries. So I began to pause. When Saad asked if I wanted to join them for something, I checked in with myself before answering. Not to withdraw, but to be honest. Sometimes I said yes gladly. Sometimes I said no, gently. Each time, the world didn't collapse. No one questioned my love. No one accused me of changing. The fear that had kept me overextended for years turned out to be unfounded. I hadn't been holding the family together by force. They were strong enough without me managing every thread. The most surprising part was how choosing myself made my presence more meaningful. When I joined them now, it was intentional. I was there because I wanted to be, not because I felt obligated. And they felt that difference. One evening, Saad looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You seem lighter." I smiled, unsure how to explain it without turning it into a confession. I think I finally stopped arguing with myself, I said. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Choosing myself didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped disappearing. I began taking long walks alone, not as an escape, but as a return, to thoughts I had ignored, to feelings I had postponed. I noticed how much of myself I had set aside over the years, quietly, without ceremony. My preferences at my pace to my voice. None of them were gone. They had just been waiting. There were moments of doubt, of course. Moments when I wondered if I was becoming distant, if I was slowly stepping out of their lives. But each time, something grounded me, a shared laugh, a check-in, a small gesture of inclusion. Love was still there. It hadn't required my self-erasure to survive. One afternoon, Sanaa and I sat together folding laundry. It was an ordinary task, one I had done countless times before, but this time felt different. There was ease between us. No tension. No roles to perform. She glanced at me and said quietly, "I'm glad you take time for yourself." The words caught me off guard. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something important. She wasn't replacing me. She was standing beside me. In that moment, I understood that choosing myself didn't mean leaving my family behind. It meant showing up as a whole person rather than a function. I could love without overgiving, support without controlling, be present without being consumed. That realization changed the way I moved through the house. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I did. I stopped scanning for approval. I stopped explaining myself when silence was enough. And in that quiet confidence, I found something unexpected. Respect. Not demanded, not negotiated, but earned simply by honoring myself. Choosing myself didn't shrink my place in the family. It clarified it. I wasn't the center. I wasn't the shadow. I was exactly where I needed to be. There was no single moment when everything resolved. No conversation where apologies were exchanged. And dramatic realization that changed the house overnight. What came instead was something gentler. Something real. Acceptance. I woke up one morning and noticed the silence again. But this time, it didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. The kind that doesn't demand explanation. The kind that settles in your chest and stays. Saad and Sanaa moved through the house with their own rhythm. Their lives no longer revolved around me, and for the first time, I didn't need them to. I watched them with quiet affection, not as someone being left behind, but as someone witnessing growth. My son had become a man in his own right, my daughter-in-law had found her voice, and I had finally found mine, after years of mistaking silence for erasure. I realized then that love does not always announce itself through need. Sometimes, love shows up as trust. Sometimes as space, sometimes as the freedom to step back without being forgotten. I was still included, not by obligation but by choice. When they came to me now, it was because they wanted to, not because they depended on me to hold things together. And that mattered more than I ever expected. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, Saad reached for my hand absent-mindedly, the way he used to when he was younger. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In that simple gesture, I felt everything I had once feared losing. I hadn't lost my place. It had changed. And change, I learned, is not rejection. It is evolution. I was no longer the center of their world, but I was part of it. No longer needed, but still loved. No longer defining myself through sacrifice, but through presence. I had stopped explaining myself, stopped competing with the past, stopped measuring love by how much of me it required. What remained was something stronger. Dignity, peace, and a love that stayed, even when it no longer depended on me. And that, I realized, was enough.